Sue, who's in this photograph?
That's my husband,
Mhm.
Tech Sergeant Jack Daugherty.
Jack Daugherty, And it says U.S. Air Force. He was in the Arkansas Air Guard, if I remember right.
Yes.
Correct. And also the Oklahoma Guard?
Yes, both. He served a few years in Arkansas Guard
Mm-hmm.
in ammunitions. And when they switched over to drones, his job was no longer needed the number of people in that position, so he made the choice to go to Tulsa so that he could do the same job that he was doing before.
So Arkansas switched to drones, but Oklahoma hadn't done that yet?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just go through a couple photos here. What are we looking at here?
That is when he re-enlisted for his last 6 years.
Yeah.
And that's in Tulsa, and he recently retired. December of 2018, he retired with 21 years.
21 years.
Yeah.
So he did 10 years in the Navy.
That's correct.
And then 10 years with the Air Guard, Arkansas and Oklahoma. But you weren't married when he was in the Navy.
No, we met when he got out of the Navy.
Met when he got out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how many times was Jack deployed?
He was deployed 3 times to Afghanistan.
3 times to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And what year did he join the Guard, the Arkansas Air Guard?
I would say it was probably like 2000. I'm trying to think back.
Yeah.
2000, mid-2000s, I'm going to say.
Oh, okay. But it was after 9/11.
It was after 9/11, definitely.
Yeah. What do you remember what motivated him to
Well,
join
actually, yes, he had been in the Navy 10 years and got out. He was ready for a break. He got out, and he was actually out for 10 years.
Wow,
So it was probably about 2006 then, because he got out in 1996.
Yeah.
And so 10 years later, he decided he was very close to being able to get retirement, and I think he missed it to some extent. He missed the camaraderie of the guys and doing something different from his everyday responsibilities. And so at that time, he decided he wanted to get back in, and he chose the Air Force because he had a brother and sister-in-law, both who were at that time in the Air Force. And he always heard good things about the Air Force, and so he decided to try that, and he was very happy with that move.
Yeah. Now this is 2006, so we're several years after 9/11. And I don't remember exactly. I think by that point Afghanistan had kind of become a secondary thing. Most attention was on Iraq. But of course when you go into the military, you don't know where you're going to be 1 or 2 years down the road. I mean, was there, so far as you remember, was there kind of an assumption? You know, I'm going back into the service in 2006 when, you know, news from Iraq is pretty much every day, and not much of it is good. Was there kind of an assumption that he's probably going to end up going overseas?
I think so. I think he thought he would probably go to Iraq.
Yeah.
But,
what do you think that was part of the attraction, sort of a desire to want to be involved in what was going on overseas?
No, I don't know that it was necessarily that. I think that it made him feel good to be able to contribute to the work of the military.
Yeah.
And he was willing to go as far as being deployed, which he knew he would be deployed, to do his part to help.
And so he was deployed 3 times, and pretty close together, right? If I remember, I think I have this correct, 2010, 2012, 2013.
That's correct.
Yeah. How long were those deployments, just roughly?
The first one, I think, was a 6-month deployment.
Wow.
The second and third ones were anywhere between 3 and 6 months.
Yeah.
The difficulty was between the second and the third one, he was only home for 6 to 8 months before he deployed again.
Wow. Yeah.
And it sometimes takes that long to reacclimate to the family lifestyle for everyone when they come back from deployment.
So yeah, so the airman comes back. Takes a while to get used to civilian life again. Of course, he's still in the Guard, but it goes back to his full-time work. After 6 months, you kind of come up with your own routines, and so there's that readjustment period. And then not long after the readjustment period settles, then off he goes again.
Off he goes again.
Yeah. So what was this like from your perspective? I mean, I asked, kind of what motivated Jack to go back into the service in 2006. What was your own thought process about this? I mean, obviously you're aware that the U.S. has, at that time, a pretty tough situation on its hands in Iraq. Afghanistan, I don't think, is in the news as much, but of course it's still going, all these years later. What was your own thought process about that?
I tend not to be I tend not to try to worry about what might be. And so I knew how much he wanted to go back into the military. I knew how much it meant to him. And I wanted to support him in that. And so I tried not to focus on what was going on in Iraq, what I was hearing, what the news was broadcasting, because it paints a very gloomy picture, and I'm sure it is very gloomy and very hard to adjust to. But for me, I just knew how much he wanted to serve his country. And if this was how he wanted to do it, I was going to support him 100%. So I didn't worry about him going back into the military.
No. When he was deployed, did you, pay much attention to the news from overseas? Or, like some people say, you hear some folks say, I really became focused on it. Others say, I kind of intentionally didn't pay attention. Others were like, well, I generally, but no different from 6 months before. How about for you?
I would say for me it was about that. I would watch it and maybe pay a little bit more attention to it, but again, not let it cause me to be worried or be concerned about what was going on. And one of the reasons for me was because his job was on base. And yes, there is always concern, even on base, especially when you're working in a bomb dump. Because that's a huge target. But I knew he wasn't going out in the field.
He's not out on patrols.
He's not out on patrol. So I knew he had a little bit higher level of safety staying on base. So most of the stories you would hear were about the patrol units and what was happening to them.
The improvised explosive devices and...
So I could easily separate what he was doing from what I was hearing on the news. More so than probably most people would be able to do.
As you get through 1 deployment, 2 deployments, 3 deployments, in your own mind, were you kind of thinking, okay, I'm looking forward to getting to the 20-year mark so we can be done with this?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Did Jack feel the same?
Absolutely. I don't think either one of us were very excited about the third deployment. Because, as I said earlier, every time they come home, there's a huge readjustment period. And during his second deployment, he did have a very close call. And it scared him. He didn't tell me much about it. It's only in years after that I heard more about it. But so going the third time was a little bit more apprehensive for both of us. Because of that. And it did affect him more severely. By the time he came home the third time, I thought he could not go again. He would not be able to mentally, emotionally handle a 4th trip to Afghanistan.
It's something, I mean, in the late 80s, I just know from personal experience, in a 1 4-year enlistment, doing 2 6-month deployments and then 1 3-month deployment, that seemed like a lot in 4 years. But this is a much more intense thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned the close call. Do you remember what the basics were of that?
There were often incoming missiles onto the base.
Yeah.
And one was coming into the bomb dump where they were working. And they got warning that a missile was coming in. And they followed protocol to safety. And when they came out of safety, they saw that the missile landed right where they had been working.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so had they hesitated for a moment, it could have been devastating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. You said that after the 3rd deployment, Jack's own state was, I think you said after the 3rd deployment, he himself had come to a place where, like, okay, enough of this. Do you have a sense of why that was? I mean, what was it that took the greatest toll? Being away from home, or just, I imagine they're doing 12, 15-hour days over there. What do you think was maybe the greatest factor there?
I mean, really all of it. I know at that point he was tired of being away from his family.
Yeah.
His boys were growing up and he wasn't there for a lot of that. I also know that the conditions over there were very difficult, and he would tell us all the time about the dust and the sandstorms and the dryness and the sometimes terrible sleeping conditions. And so, and I think always the worry that something could happen. He had been fortunate 3 times, but there was never any guarantee that nothing would happen. And so I think just the combination of all those things, he was just ready to say, no, I just don't want to do this. He would have, and he was going to deploy again, but not to Afghanistan, to a different country.
Okay.
And during that 4th opportunity to deploy, he was actually ready to go. He was in Tulsa ready to go. And we had a crisis in our family, and our older son had passed away unexpectedly. And so he was in Tulsa. I was home. Of course, I was already anxious about him leaving again. And he was already thinking towards, changing his mindset to be doing what he needed to do there. And he got the call there that his son had passed away. And it was an extremely difficult time for us. And of course, immediately he came home and didn't have to go. And
the son's name was Chris.
His son's name was Chris, yes. And he had been very much a part of everything, all the other deployments. He had been a great help to me because he was older than Daniel, his younger brother. He was 11 years older, than his brother. So he was a great help to me when Jack was gone on those previous deployments. So, so there were a lot of emotions, a lot of things going on then, and especially after that point in time, Jack knew he just did not want to go anywhere again. No matter where it was, he did not want to have to go.
And he was pretty close to being done at that point, or he had another few years to go?
Yeah, he had another three and a half years to go.
Did he talk to his commanders and just say, look, enough's enough?
They actually did deploy again about 6 months before he was ready to retire, or 6 to 12 months, somewhere in that range, and he did not have to go.
Wow. Yeah.
So we were grateful for that. We were concerned all along, waiting to hear that he was exempt from going.
Sure.
But they eventually said he did not have to go.
So he did go to his commanders and just say, look, can we work something out?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think most people would agree. I mean, three deployments that close together, that's tough on anyone, but especially on someone with a family. And then, now when Jack got the word in Tulsa, and needed to come home. Did he have to get himself home, or
He had to drive himself home from Tulsa.
did he have a car, or did he have to get a rental?
He had a
or-
truck. No, he had brought his
Oh.
truck from home to Tulsa and was going to leave it on the base in Tulsa.
Oh, well, leaving on the base.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So he had to bring himself.
But he
home.
had to bring himself home, and he had to deal with the grief.
Oh boy.
And yeah,
Yeah, that's tough.
it was a trying
That's tough
time, but
stuff.
our faith got us through, and
Yeah.
we just, you know, it's just part of our everyday. It was part of our life. The military was part of our everyday life. This loss added a new element to that.
Mm.
And we're the type of people that figure out how to cope, how to make it work, how to
Mhm.
live in the real situation.
Yeah.
It was never easy. It's not
Sure.
easy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Was something else that made this whole experience kind of challenging? I mean, there are the things to feel good about and the things to be proud of, and we can talk about those. But I mean, everyone recognizes this is a challenging situation, even without the additional, I mean, incredible hardship that your family had to deal with. You know, just the normal course of going on deployments is a difficult thing. Is something else that contributed to that? Well, let me put it this way. Let me set it up this way. There's a story that kind of made the rounds. I don't know if it actually happened or not, but it's a kind of a story that illustrates a certain point that went around. And the story is that a woman was talking to a military officer, I think an Army officer, and she just mentioned, you know, that the country was at war. And according to the story, the Army officer responds and says, "Ma'am, the country is at the mall. The Army is at war." And the sense of and what that gets to is you know, something that, you know, as I look back, I observe in my own case, that I was aware of a war in Iraq, I was aware of a war in Afghanistan. I would occasionally talk to people about it, but my life just carried on. It didn't seem to have any impact on me that I can remember whatsoever. But, you know, you don't live very far from me. You know, you're down the street, and you're dealing with it. You know, it's a daily reality for you. Do you identify with that? I mean, do you think that, did you feel isolated in some sense, or feel like, you know, me and a very small number of people are carrying a burden for the country, but the vast majority of the people in the country, even though they may say thank you for your service,
right.
they're carrying on with their lives. It has no impact on them. No notable impact on them. Was that something that else made it difficult?
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
From the standpoint that people knew that he was gone. People knew that, you know, I was carrying on at home. But they didn't see that it should make a difference in my lifestyle. So your spouse is gone and you pick up the extra load, and so you're doing double duty, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you're just trying to keep everything together. You're trying to be extra emotionally strong for your family. And people around you just see it happening, so they don't think about what it's really like for that individual, that family.
Yeah.
And it's not intentional. It's just an unawareness of what's going on in someone else's life.
Sure.
It's one thing to say, oh, I know your spouse is gone. It's another thing to recognize, he's gone, how can I help you? What kind of support do you need? Do you, you know?
Yeah.
And I did have a few people in my life that were very good about that. My church family was very good about supporting me and occasionally bringing me meals, or they would take Daniel for an afternoon, so I had an afternoon to myself.
Yeah.
But the general public, it's very odd feeling to be in the general public, to be at a social event where you're with people you may not know, and life is carrying on as if nothing was happening. And deep down, you know, a whole lot is happening.
Yeah, the world really, there's a feeling like the world really should just stop for a second and recognize what's going on.
Sure.
But people carry on. I wonder if this was, and I mean, with Iraq and Afghanistan going on simultaneously, the state guards really did pick up a lot of the burden of these two conflicts. And I'm just thinking about this. I mean, the advantage of being, say, near Camp Pendleton in California is that you've got a lot of Marine families around, and folks can identify with each other. Or if you live on or near a base, there's just that understanding that there are people around here who are carrying this burden. But when it comes to guard units, there's not a military base other than the National Guard Armory, here in town, which we hardly even notice. There are no bases close by, and I wonder if, in that sense, it was even more difficult for family members of folks in the Guard.
Absolutely.
Because you don't have that military community around.
I remember the first time he was deployed, I knew nothing about what was going on. I did not come. My father served in the Army National Guard, but I don't remember any of that, just for a few years. And so I was not exposed to any of this military lifestyle at all. And so the first time he was deployed, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to expect with him leaving. I didn't know what to expect while he was gone, as far as what challenges I might have to face that I didn't face before. But coming home, too, I remember not knowing, when's he coming home? When do we meet him? Where do we go? I was fortunate to have one family that did live in Siloam Springs whose lady's husband also was in the Fort Smith Air Guard. And so I had gotten her number. And I hated to bother anybody. I'm that type of person. But I did get so anxious about not knowing that I did call her and I said, can you just give me some insight? Because there are lots of times when they're gone and you can't hear from your spouse. And you don't know. Because they don't have access to communicate with you. There's a whole infrastructure around the bases, that is just there because you've got a critical mass of people with this common thing that's happening. But gosh, it must have been really hard. I mean, did the Arkansas Guard, the Oklahoma Guard, did they make an attempt to try to provide some of that infrastructure for family members? There were people I could contact down in Fort Smith and ask those questions and try to get some answers. And it just was all so foreign to me. I didn't know where to turn. And I tend to be somewhat of an independent person anyway, so I just thought, I'll figure it out. But in reality, I couldn't figure it out. I had no basis to go from. And so they were helpful, but the first time around, it was still a very hard experience for me.
I mean, growing up, to me, the National Guard was the thing you joined, and I mean, just to put it crassly, and I was a 19-year-old thinking about going into the military. The Guard was the thing you joined and got a check once a month in exchange for pretty much nothing. That was kind of my perception of it. But come Iraq, come Afghanistan, and now the Guard is really, the National Guard is really, and the Air Guard.
They deploy more than the full-time people.
They're bearing a big part of the burden. Well, let's go through some photos here. So the photos that you brought in, just give us just a general statement about some of these photos as we go through them.
Well, this was an exciting day for us because it was a re-enlistment day for Jack. But we knew it'd be the last re-enlistment he would have. And he re-enlisted for 6 years so that he was sure to get his 20 years in. So it was exciting, but somewhat apprehensive at the same time because we didn't know at that point, how much more he'd have to do. And
Now,
where you'd have to
was
go.
there a deployment? There was a deployment in that last, yeah.
Yeah.
That was, so
Yeah.
more to come. How about this one?
That's a picture of Jack and his grandparents, and his grandparents were always very proud of him. And that was the day that he was leaving to go to Tulsa to deploy.
Oh.
And so he was saying his goodbyes to them. And he came from a long line of military service, so they were, they were very proud to see him off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about this one?
That's a picture of Jack and my youngest son Daniel, and to me it really signifies a hard goodbye. They both are not wanting to say goodbye, but knowing it's coming anyways.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Did Daniel have any understanding of, why his dad is going to Afghanistan? I mean, did he, in a little kid way, any kind of little kid understanding of the war on terror? Or like if somebody said, well, why is your dad in Afghanistan?
No, I don't think he would have been able to answer that question. I think his answer would have been, it's a job he does. I don't think he really would have understood.
Sure.
Not at that time.
Yeah.
Another picture of the days before getting ready to leave. And those were always some of the hardest days, because by that time my husband was already mentally preparing himself to be gone.
And does that mean that in a sense he was kind of psychologically moving into a different zone?
Yes, detaching.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do remember hearing this when I was in the service and before we went out on deployments. And I was single and kind of on my own, so it didn't affect me much in this way. But I remember hearing from guys who had families that you would expect those last few days before deployment to be really sweet and close and cuddly. But at least in some cases, they're actually kind of filled with stress and conflict.
In our situation, that was more it. It was not, it was just a very stressful time, because I could clearly see that he was already separating, he was already detaching, and I wanted it to be more of a, the last few minutes together were fun and happy, and so I always tried to keep things upbeat and keep him engaged as much as I could.
Yeah.
But when you walk into the room and you see his bags packed sitting on the floor, and your son's draped over it, he's feeling the stress or the unhappiness about Dad leaving. And
psychologically, he's already on his way to Afghanistan.
Yeah,
he knows what it
absolutely.
looks like.
Absolutely.
You know that life is going to be a lot stressful the next several months, and it makes sense that the ideal would we know what the ideal is, but yeah, given that situation, it makes sense that could be a stressful time. What are we looking at here?
This was at the Fort Smith Air Base, waiting to deploy. So we were there as a family, and it's a long waiting period. You go and you wait and you wait and you wait, and they take them away and do some debriefing, and they bring them back, and you wait some more and you wait some more. They're very accommodating, but this was a photo I took that I thought just expressed, you tried to find something to do. I encouraged Jack to get his mind off of where he was going at that moment, and again, try to spend a few extra minutes with his son. And so this was just a time that they found that to do.
Yeah. What is this?
This is from the first deployment, when Daniel got a letter from his dad.
Now, so, that's pretty old school, right? An old-fashioned handwritten letter. Why do you think Jack, I'm sure you communicated electronically.
He did mostly communicate by writing.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Is that because he hadn't personally transitioned yet to sort of the email world?
I think because he may not have had a laptop that first time. I don't really remember what the circumstance was. I also know that a lot of times it was very difficult to access the internet
Oh,
from
sure.
where they were. When they could access the internet, you didn't know how long you had.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In the second and third deployment, we were able to Skype more, and
Okay.
so there were fewer letters. But the first deployment, there
Yeah.
were just a lot of written communication, and I would
Yeah.
write to him just so that he would get something other than knowing we were going to Skype at a certain time. We did have some fun with it. We one time we sent him a funny pair of men's pajamas,
Yeah.
Star
Yeah.
Wars pajamas. So he would open a present, and
Yeah.
even if he never wore them,
Yeah.
it was something
Right.
funny, something from home.
Well, I think email and Skype and all that stuff is nice, and you can be in regular contact. But Jack and I actually talked about this. There was something really nice and sweet about in the old days when everything was old-fashioned mail.
Yeah.
Hearing that there was a mail call and that feeling of anticipation and getting something could be incredibly deflating if you didn't get
Right,
anything.
right.
But now, did y'all think to save these letters and to
Yes.
preserve them? So
Yes,
you've
we
got
do
them.
have them.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's nice. That's great.
Another thing that helped me a lot, I think, during this time, during his deployments, was our church started a ministry. It was called the SOS ministry, and it was serving our soldiers. And every month we would get together and pack boxes
Oh, that's great.
for soldiers of people that had said, my grandson, my nephew, my cousin, my husband, my wife, whatever, was overseas, and we would collect their names and addresses and send them packages,
that's
care
great.
packages,
Yeah.
and then we would meet monthly and pray for those soldiers.
Oh, that's great.
And that was very uplifting and helpful to me to know
Sure.
that this nucleus of people really knew what
Yeah.
I was feeling at any given time.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
when we would meet to pray, they would ask me to share specifically what I wanted them to pray about.
Yeah.
So that was very uplifting for me. That was very helpful to me.
Yeah.
And I imagine that most people don't have that nucleus of people that are willing to see what
Yeah.
the need is, or to be willing to open themselves up to say, I want to be there for you, even though I don't understand what you're going through. How can I help you?
Yeah, members of Guard families who don't go to church
Right.
or don't have those kind of civic connections.
Absolutely.
That must be very tough. Let's go through some more of your photos. What is this?
That is called the Blue Star flag, and that indicates that I have one Blue Star family member in active duty, and I would hang that in my front window. And I'm sure that most people didn't know what it meant,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
when I learned what it was, whenever I see one,
Yeah.
I immediately stop and pray for that home. So I hope that other people will understand that when they see that, that signifies
Yeah.
that they're dealing with a loved one who's gone.
Sure. So you put that up when Jack deployed. Did you have it for the first deployment?
I believe I did.
Yeah.
I believe I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here?
And this is at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. And they have what they call the Pease Greeters. And these are just everyday folk. A lot of them are retired or veterans or whatever, but they are people who come to the airport to greet the planes as they come in. And again, I think it's just Air Force planes, because this is the first stop those planes make when they come in from overseas. They stop at this air base. And so they have the heroes walk, and they feed them, and they have phones set up for them to make phone calls, and they welcome them, and they visit with them. They bring dogs in for comfort for the guys to.
Sure.
It's just a really neat experience. The photo on the right is my sister and her husband, who live in New Hampshire. And they got to go and greet my husband when he arrived in New Hampshire that day.
Oh, that's great.
And that was such a big deal for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's another photo of them on the Heroes Walk.
Yeah.
And you can just see all the people just welcoming them home.
Yeah, and what a difference, right? I think this reminds us of a lesson learned from the Vietnam era,
Yeah.
right? That however people personally felt about Iraq, Afghanistan, it's important to distinguish between the troops
That's right.
and the decisions the government makes.
They're not the choice of war. They didn't make that choice to have the war.
Right.
But they made the choice to go and serve.
Yeah.
And this picture is them actually making it home in Arkansas. This again is Fort Smith, and they're getting off the plane, and this is a point where the families are all standing there looking for their loved ones, trying to see their loved one get off the airplane.
Yeah, I think I see Jack. Has he just gotten off the steps?
Could be.
There. I think.
I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, it looks to me. Well, I'm not certain, but it looks like he's just gotten off the last step.
Could be, and that could be
I think so.
that. Yes, that could be him, and that could be why I snapped that photo, because I thought that was him.
Yeah.
A great time of anticipation and excitement.
Yeah.
And this was our welcome home for Jack the first time he left town.
Boy.
But you can see how people just get all excited and do whatever they can to make the guys feel welcome when they come home.
Now I noticed that you did a better job getting the whole word welcome on one side. Those other folks had to put the E on the... Yeah, they didn't plan that one out very well. You did a better job with that one. So, well, that's great. What are we looking at here?
This was our home that we decorated. I believe this was after his second deployment. I wanted to do something special for him and let him know that we really missed him, but we were really glad he was home. And so I lined the driveway with the flags.
Nice.
And we had signs made for the windows, and we left them up for quite a while after he got home, so people would see that he was back.
Yeah. Well, Sue, as we finish up, even as we speak, family members are preparing for deployments. We have a small number of troops relative to what we had before, a small number of troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Syria area, Turkey. The sailors are getting ready. They're at sea now. Others are preparing to deploy. So there are many thousands of people who are facing one or another kind of deployment. What would be your counsel to someone who's facing that for the first time, a long deployment?
As a family member, I would say seek out other family members. Find out who might live in the same town as you do. And you would probably be able to find out that information through the air base. Try to make it a point, even before your family member leaves, to get connected with the spouse of one of his friends or her friends, which is also something that I tried to do, so that you had somebody you could contact, somebody you could just talk to and say, have you heard from so-and-so, or how are you doing, or how have you handled this situation, to not feel like you have to be alone. There are people that will help. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging to find them, but find help.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to do it alone. And when people say, other friends say to you, is there anything I can do? Be honest. Say, yes, I would love a cooked meal for such and such a night, or I would love to be able to take a few hours and go do something. Could you watch my children? Or anything, whatever it is. Or I need help with my vehicle because it's not working right. Do you know someone that could help me? Let other people help make those connections for you, so that you aren't feeling stranded because your spouse or that significant other person is not there to help resolve the problem for you.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid of it. I always made my priority with Jack to let him know that we were doing okay at home. Absolutely, we missed him. I would, when I knew he was going to Skype with us, I would turn my computer on. I would turn it up as loud as I could.
Mm.
And if I were like in the kitchen or in another room, I wanted to hear if he was online.
Mm-hmm.
So I would turn it up as loud as I could, or I would have one of the boys sit in the room and say, now, Dad's going to call, you listen.
Mm-hmm.
That was so important to me. So every one of those touch points made a difference in us getting through the day, as I'm sure it did for him getting
Sure.
through his time.
Yeah.
And so those touch points are important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
hear that, yeah. Well, Sue, thanks very much for taking this time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for asking
Thank you.
me.
You bet.
Mhm.